And as I said earlier, the purpose and design behind this next panel is to really share with us as part of this learning agenda models for collaboration across the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. And so we have a distinguished panel. I'm going to turn it over to Ben Heck to introduce the panel. Ben is the president and CEO of Living Cities. Living Cities is a collaborative of foundations and the federal government. And has been investing in communities across the U.S. for more than 20 years. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, this is great. So not only we have like all the less time to spend, and we have to follow the president. It's perfect. It should go well. As Erica said, I'm the head of Living Cities, which is a collaboration. So I guess it's a good idea that I'm leading the panel on collaboration, because we are a 20-year-old collaboration of financial institutions and foundations. Many of them are here in the room today. And we have found over the years, much like what the mayor said, was that the only way you really can bring about the kind of change to the complex problems we have is by doing it in a collaborative way. And because over the time, sometimes governments will be strong and weak, sometimes nonprofits will be strong and weak, sometimes philanthropy will be strong and weak. And the key is, how can you build a resilient group, a civic infrastructure that can kind of take on those problems? And so we put together a panel today to try to give you exposure to some of the best and most unique examples of collaboration and leaders of collaboration in very different ways. And so I just want to briefly introduce the folks here, give you a little bit of context, but then get right into asking them some questions about what they've learned about collaboration that they think they'd want to share with you. Starting here on my left is Brian Fabes, and Brian is the head of the Civic Consulting Alliance, which helps to bring $20 million a year of private sector consulting to cities. And we'll talk a little bit about that incredibly unique approach, essentially bringing cities, private sector skills and resources that they otherwise would spend literally millions of dollars on doing. Next to him is Mayor Chris Coleman from the city of St. Paul. And if you've had a chance, like I have, to spend time with Mayor Coleman, he has led an incredible array of collaborations in the Twin Cities, including working incredibly well with the mayor of Minneapolis. And if you know the area at all, there's not a great history of the two working together, but instead fighting. And they've really been able to do in now, I think the mayor's in his second term, 6 years or so in office, to be able to really make the Twin Cities, I think, the model of how not only you work together, but the economic results that you get from doing that. And they have a number of ways, including bringing in the vibrant private sector that they have in the Twin Cities. To his left is Shanae Harris, who is the head of the Prudential Foundation. And Shanae is based in Newark, but they work all over the country. But what's really interesting about Shanae and her work is they are both a corporation as Prudential, but also a foundation. And they play as a major player in Newark for moving Newark forward, especially during what I call the lean years, because I grew up around Newark, where the only really functional entity in Newark was Prudential. And how have they been able to build partnerships now as the government and others and the civic sector has been reborn? To the left of Shanae is Scott Spencer. And Scott works at the Annie Casey Foundation, ran their Baltimore programs for years, is currently the chair of the Funders Network. And if anybody knows Baltimore at all, what they've been able to do in East Baltimore under Scott's direction was to bring together Hopkins University and others, the state, the city, and Annie Casey as a Baltimore-based foundation, bringing all of its assets, grants, people, endowment to bear to make a difference in that community, as well as Casey working in communities around the country. So we have an incredible array of different approaches to collaboration and in different roles. And so we'll see in the 5 minutes left how much we get out, of them. But maybe I'll start with you, Mayor, and ask if you could share what you believe you've learned about collaboration, and what's the key to making it work.
Well, first thing I've learned today is that immediately after the president leaves, they take down the seal of office, just so no one confuses us with the president. So I guess we know where we sit. There are a lot of things I've learned about collaboration and cooperation. One of the things I think about is I think it's almost ingrained in the DNA of St. Paulites and of Minnesotans to collaborate with folks, largely because we don't want to get blamed when things go wrong. And so we work very hard at these things. We have a tremendous civic network that has been built up over the years, a lot of support from the business community, from the corporate foundation community, then the other philanthropic partners, not just in the city of St. Paul, but really across the region and across the country. Knight Foundation has been an incredibly strong partner with us, and a lot of others that are starting to emerge. It's nice to see that the Midwest has actually been recognized as part of the country sometimes. We appreciate that. But I think the things that I've learned are, first of all, that from a philanthropic or from a business standpoint, they have to be very patient and understand kind of how government works, what government has to do in order to be able to really bring people along. The kind of buy-in that is necessary, I think, is not necessarily inherent, particularly in the corporate business sector. They don't understand why we have to go through all these community meetings, why we have to have a lot of outreach, a lot of work very specifically with historically disenfranchised communities to really get them to believe in what was happening. And I think there's a certain degree of patience. From a city standpoint, we have to learn to not always have to be the person that gets the credit. I think it's absolutely essential that mayors and other leaders take that leadership position. But if you're the person that has to just always be the one, it's my job, it's my initiative, it's my this, it's my that, foundations get real tired of that. Corporate partners get really tired of that very quickly, and they'll back away and say, wait a second, I don't want to be beholden to this person's initiative because we know that this person may not be there forever. I hope I'm around for a little bit longer, but the fact is they have to work through multiple administrations and multiple mayors in most instances. And so we have to understand we're part of it, and from a government standpoint, we're in a very important part of it, but we ain't the only thing there.
Yeah, that's great. Sinead, let me ask you the same question.
Well, I would say that the biggest thing I've learned is collaboration is hard. And I think we all know that. But, I think from Prudential's standpoint, we knew very early on that in order to really make the impact that we were seeking, that we needed to have a broader set of partners at the table, that it wasn't enough to have a dedicated corporation and only a philanthropic lens. So it just made common sense, I think, again, to collaborate and bring in multiple perspectives to kind of deal with how do you solve a problem effectively. And it's worked for us. It's a very important part to our grant making because we know that just throwing dollars at a problem is not going to solve it alone. And if you have a very coherent strategy that is nuanced and applies multiple perspectives from different sectors, you have a chance of sustaining something and making a long-lasting impact.
And Brian, working with corporate folks, what have you learned about engaging the corporate sector, which is not easy to do? Like the mayor said, the attention span, the meetings. How have you been able to? What have you learned about engaging the corporate communities that these folks could take back home with them?
Well, it's funny. I think the lessons that I've learned. Just didn't feel like it. I used to teach. I could probably do it loud. I think the lessons that I've learned are the same things we've been hearing all day. It's about trust. It's about vision. Real briefly, because we're kind of an odd animal, we provide pro bono consulting services to the public sector, the mayor, the head of the community colleges, public schools, county board president, using my own staff, the pro bono resources of the business community, and then working with public sector leaders who want to make a big difference in Chicago. And what makes our model distinctive is that we don't just go and do a project. We pick issues that matter where there are public sector leaders who want to make a significant difference, and then we'll commit our resources and those of the private sector in Chicago over time to making a significant difference. And it could be everything from revamping the community colleges to running the transition plan for the new mayor to to being in charge of implementing climate action plan. Summing it all up, last year you mentioned about $20 million of resources, about 385 private sector entities, about 700-800 people, 140 projects. A real significant piece of the civic infrastructure. And every time we try to say, wow, why is this working? We come back to a couple things. The first is the exact opposite of what my colleague on the left said. Well, it's way the same. We're both from the Midwest, and I'm from Minneapolis, by the way. It can't be about us. It has to be about the outcome. And you have to let public sector leaders lead. You have to find those who want to lead. If we get in the business of deciding it's our thing, if we want to make public announcements, we're not going to have clients to work with. The second thing, so it's about, it can't be about yourself. You have to let it be about other people. The second thing that people talked about are trust. These things take time. I like to joke usually in smaller groups, but nothing ever gets out of DC, I know. So,
your secret's safe.
Right. No, I mean, I have on my computer every inspection that is legally required and not done in the city of Chicago. Because they trust us. This isn't about getting it to the paper. This is about how are we going to solve it to make sure inspectors are working on the things that promote public safety. By the way, it's mostly low voltage alarms when you put a new alarm in your house. And then the third thing, it's got to be about results. And that, if there's one thing that's been really interesting in growing this, is it's not about doing a project. People want to see stuff happen. And people, I think, in the morning talked about results. Right. And so it's not doing a project about alarms. It's about making Chicago the safest city or making education the safest. And this always comes up in odd ways. We're really proud of the leverage, right? We're like $2 million in cost, and we provide $20 million of services. We go to the foundations and we say, aren't we great leverage? And they say, we don't care about that. You're about results. Right. So it's results, it's trust, and it can't be about us, and then it works.
Okay. Scott.
Yeah, I had, in adding to these comments, one thing I have learned about collaboration over the years is that historically we did not come into collaboration because we wanted to. We came to it out of necessity. I mean, people don't necessarily just say, oh, we're going to collaborate and we're going to make something happen. It is out of necessity. It's because someone has a better competency at something than someone else does. And so you learn to balance those competencies, but in balancing that, you also learn that collaboration means that people have different agendas, different urgencies, different frequencies, different timetables, the same outcome maybe that you're trying to achieve, but there are different touch points around what this collaboration means. And so when you're working in this collaboration, you sort of need to come into it understanding those touch points. Sometimes it's political cycles. Sometimes for philanthropy, it could be about the outcome or gathering enough data to be able to build enough evidence to say that we can march forward with this. With communities, collaboration has a whole different meaning. I mean, in certain ways, to a community, especially if you're a resident in a community that's being impacted by the collaborative effort, it is a threat in certain ways, and it rises up in lots of ways. And so one of the other things that you need to learn about collaboration, having done work around construction and building trades, when you build a building, you actually put in a contingency for things that you don't expect to happen. But you don't put in a contingency generally around collaboration and the collaborative process. So you need to build in the time that it's going to take to get through those issues, get through the sensitivities, get through the angst, get through the anger, get through the accusations, get through the Saturday evening meetings, the Sunday afternoon conferences, and all that kind of stuff in order to make it work. And until we really start doing that as sort of a forethought to our collaboration process, we're going to keep on stumbling along the ground.
Let me ask you what's the best collaborative success you've seen, whether you've been involved in it or otherwise, and why do you think it was successful?
There are a couple of them, and one of them is right in Mayor Coleman's backyard. So I won't steal his thunder, but but they're around the same theme. Whether it's Great Communities Collaborative in the Bay Area around the equity investments in transit-oriented development, or whether it's the Mile High Transit Opportunity Collaborative in the Denver area, where the Denver region actually voted itself, and this is sort of the public-private philanthropic collaboration, where the public sector and citizens actually voted to tax themselves to build out a transit system. Then philanthropic investments came in behind that to really support the development of a TOD investment fund, a $30 million TOD investment fund, which brought together financial institutions, philanthropy, the city of Denver, and the community surrounding. And then philanthropy, coming in behind that and deciding to invest actually the money that they didn't get out of the Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant to actually boost the capacity of a local coordinating effort to make sure that the investment strategy could actually work.
And could you point to one thing that you think screams at you as being the secret sauce or the greatest catalyst to that?
I'm not going to steal his thunder again, but really the key catalyst is leadership. Yeah. I mean, the president said it just now. It is about, these things don't happen in cities. They don't happen in neighborhoods. They happen partially because of regional coordination and regional leadership. Philanthropy doesn't just come in because we think it's a great idea. We usually come in because there's actually a driving force that is inspiring you to want to invest in that. That's why people invest people want to invest in success and things that they think are going to be successful. And usually that comes because someone else is really driving a vision and has coordinated a vision to make you see that there's going to be success in it.
Yeah. Sinead, can I ask you the same thing? Where have you seen collaboration work, and why do you think it was successful?
Well, there are a number of examples that I could draw from just through the work that we're doing in the city of Newark. And, I think the interesting thing is that collaborations that are successful, in my mind, come about very organically. So it's not forced. And I know, from a philanthropic perspective, we love collaboration. We love getting all our grantees together and saying, now all of you work together on something and come to us with a plan of funding. And it usually doesn't work. But Prudential was a partner in a collaborative that happened about 17 years ago that really focused on a community response to the state operation of the school district at the time. And there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of outrage, and there was a thought by the civic leaders of the community, faith-based members, philanthropic members, business, that there needed to be a way for the community to come around and say to the superintendent that let's provide a platform, a vehicle for you to at least be heard. And through that became a very loose ad hoc group called the Committee of Advocates for Newark's Children. And this collaborative convened every other month at Prudential, really for sharing information, providing credible information. And from that just organic gathering, nonprofit leaders, faith-based leaders, et cetera, came over a 10-year period the need to kind of formalize this work, move beyond just a kind of critical friend in an advocacy role, but really serve to create a new organization. And about 2 years ago, this group decided to establish a local education fund in the city of Newark, which, Newark has been a hotbed of education issues nationally with the mayor, Cory Booker, who has been very engaged in education in particular. And the timing of just kind of this evolution of this very loose ad hoc collaborative to a more formalized organization couldn't have been better, because I think that the local education fund now has served as a key convener to help align strategies, to help coordinate resources, to work with the philanthropic community, but the broader civic leadership in the city and the mayor to really come with a plan, a tangible plan on school reform. So that's something that I would call a success, and it was successful in my mind because there was a personal interest that everyone had. There was something that kept people at the table besides money, and it was able to be sustained through, the leadership of Prudential and others that really worked to facilitate and kind of serve as a key convener until that group organically turned into a more formalized organization.
Interesting. Mayor, can I ask you, one of the themes of the strong cities, strong communities is the economic revitalization of these cities and communities. And have you been able to see, both before mayor and as mayor, any collaborations that actually go to the heart of the economic health of the region? And if so, what do you take away from that maybe is helpful to these folks?
Yeah, there's several different initiatives, kind of on large scale and small scale. Some are attached to the construction of the Central Corridor light rail line, which will link downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis, the University of Minnesota, the State Capitol Complex, and a whole lot of other institutions, hospitals, et cetera. And so there's been a lot of work, particularly with funders that have tried to go to the small businesses, first of all helping them survive construction of the light rail line. Really important money has gone into to loan funds and various things in order to help those businesses thrive and survive, marketing programs, et cetera. I think that's been critically important. On the larger scale, there's always been a realization that we haven't done a particularly good job in the Twin Cities of marketing who we are and what assets we have. It reminded me of a homeless person I saw in New York years ago who had a sign that said, "If you want to give me money, fine, but I'm not going to beg for it." And we had kind of a similar attitude, which is, if you want to bring jobs here to the Twin Cities, fine, but we're not going to go out and actually look for them. And we had success for us with stealing a company from Minneapolis and vice versa. That tends to not really be a good long-term strategy. And so we started recently, and this actually, the initial collaborative effect was the Itasca group, which was a group of business leaders that had come together to really start looking at different parts of the agenda: education, economic development, particularly around closing the achievement gap. They were really the first ones to identify the nature of the crisis in the Twin Cities. But through the Itasca group, we have formed a group called Greater MSP, which is the business community, the philanthropic community, almost every layer of government in the Twin Cities, counties, cities, et cetera, to really have a very focused strategy around business recruitment, retention, and expansion. And while it's only up and running for about a year, it has already repositioned ourselves from the standpoint of we just weren't out in the marketplace at all. And we really viewed Sioux Falls as our competition, not Seoul, South Korea. And so it has that level of cooperation among a lot of different sectors, I think, is probably one of the most important things that we've ever done.
Brian, what have you learned? Where's the best collaboration you've seen, and why do you think it worked?
So my focus is very Chicago-based. And I think there are a number of collaborations. I think the one that I'm finding most intriguing now is where different municipalities are working together. And I think this has been hinted at a number of times, as the mayor just talked about Minneapolis, St. Paul, is the locus of economic activity is not necessarily the city, but it's a region. And so we now have a new mayor, some of you may know here, and a county board president who is taking what has been called probably kindly the largest mismanaged municipal government in the country and moving it light years ahead. And they've said that we want to collaborate. They literally are in the same building, on the same floor, overlapping jurisdictions, and have zero history of collaboration. And that, to me, is really an intriguing and exciting example because it's really dirty stuff like, how are you going to do IT? Why do we have to have 2 IT systems? Why do we have 3 different workforce boards in Cook County? And that's really interesting because it starts with 2 leaders who say, I want to collaborate. And that's what the president said and the secretary said, you need that backup. Without that, you don't go anywhere. And now it's the hard work. But boy, when you put that leadership that says, we're going to back but to do it, and you have to do it, really interesting things can happen.
Yeah, interesting. I wanted to switch to see if you guys could give advice from your perspective to these folks if they were going after people like you. What do they need to know about talking to you to get people like you to help them in their own communities? You know, so how do they? What's the message that the corporate community wants to hear? What's the message that their public sector might want to hear? Let's say it's the county. People, I think Scott had said, people come with their own frame of reference, their own perspective.
So for me, the corporate community is relatively straightforward. And again, I may be advantaged in Chicago, where I think we have an incredible corporate community that makes extraordinary investments in the city, but they want to see something happen there from their investments. They want to see a return. And our job, quite simply, is to help them get the biggest return on their pro bono investments, whether it's their people have great experiences, or, um, or more importantly, they see what they invest in, if not this month, 6 months, or 2 years later, they see in the paper the colleges are being revamped, or in fact, the workforce boards are emerging. That's why people, at least in my view, do this work. If we can provide them that, I think they'll come.
Scott, they want to approach their foundations.
You don't want to hear this from me. You've heard the adage: if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. And in certain cases, that is true with philanthropy. There are a couple things I would say. First of all, there needs to be a real strong acknowledgement about the difference between foundations overall. I mean, some of the nationals have the capacity to do certain things that the locals don't have the ability to do, and so some of the locals and regionals have the capacity because they are much closer to the ground to do the things that the nationals can't do. And I think one of the things we need to, everybody needs to recognize is the importance that each of those elements of our sector bring to the work that goes on in communities. So, do not underestimate the power of a community foundation to be able to use not only its money, but it's human resources to be a catalyst for change in your backyard, just as you can sometimes count on larger foundations to be able to support large multi-site initiatives around the country. Secondly would be around really just getting to know the foundation. I mean, in lots of ways, this type of work, community work, is not, it's not a one and done thing. It's a long-term investment. And so it is a relationship that you need to build. And with any relationship that you need to build, you need to know who that, who your dance partner is going to be, and know how they operate, know how they work, and also acknowledge that while you may not be able to bend their will because they have prescriptions and restrictions, you may be able to actually influence their thought and how they would approach the work. So those would be a couple of key points I'd offer.
Shanae, as a corporate foundation, what advice would you give?
Well, it's interesting. We're headquartered in Newark, New Jersey, but we fund in 15 cities across the United States and now 5 countries globally. So our footprint is very broad. And a lot of times, the decisions in which we make in terms of why we're in a city has to do with the regular corporate metrics, your employee count, business interests, and then also strategic opportunities to make social impact. This is a pitch for strong collaborations, because one of the things that's very appealing to us, and I'll give you an example of the work that we do in New Orleans. And New Orleans was a city that we started partnering with primarily post-Katrina. We don't have a strong employee presence from Prudential in that region, and really don't have dedicated staff on the ground to kind of understand the local context of the work. But what we found when we came to New Orleans is there was a very strong collaborative that had networks of people working together, problem solving, and it was very easy to plug in as a partner and understand the needs, understand the strategy, and understand that this was something that could be sustained. And it's allowed us to partner over the last 5 years, and we're really proud of the work that we're doing, especially in the Central City District. And it's a very easy way for funders to understand what the broad picture is and what they can contribute to help leverage that. So that's something that we look at, especially when we're not familiar with the local landscape. How do we plug in, and how do we make a meaningful impact?
Good. Mayor, I want to ask you a different question. Then I'm going to ask Scott the same question, then we have time to open it up a little bit, Eric. So there's a lot of federal agency representatives here in the room. What advice would you give them, since you don't necessarily know who's in the room, but what advice would you give them about how they should collaborate with local partners and local government?
It's interesting. I actually believe that, and I particularly noticed with the change of administrations, that it was like night and day in terms of the willingness to reach out to cities, the willingness to partner, the willingness to break down silos for us. I say that not as a political statement, but just a fact that early on in our discussions around the Central Corridor, it was the federal government that said, hey, why don't we get folks from HUD and from DOT and Energy and all these folks in the same room at the same time, and you guys can come out and talk to us. It was HUD that, through the Sustainable Communities Grant, allowed us to develop this whole idea of the corridors of opportunity that really allowed a whole lot of different partners to come to the table. And even in yesterday, several of us from the National League of Cities met with Assistant Secretary Marquez, and just for decades we've been coming up and saying, please don't cut CDBG, please don't cut home, please don't cut this, please don't cut that. And it was the Assistant Secretary, Deputy Secretary, who said, you know what, are any of you guys willing to try a pilot program to look at something different so that we can get into a different mode? So I really think that, I don't know that it goes to every layer of all of these departments, and we've had some frustrations and we lost some opportunities. DOE has been fantastic. Department of Energy has been an absolutely great partner for us in installing solar and doing a whole lot of things. But we missed a gigantic opportunity on the Central Corridor because we couldn't get them to kind of recognize that if we could have found $17 million, we could have put a district energy system through that entire corridor that I think would have been an international model of how you do energy innovation on these corridors. So it hasn't fully permeated. I think it's the nature of bureaucratic beasts, but I think it's there's no question that this is an administration that gets it, as we just heard from the president, and it's also he's appointed some really great people, and they in turn have brought in great staff that understand this issue.
So Scott, let me ask you, with both your Casey and your Funders Network hat, what would you say about advice you might give to federal agencies on how to better collaborate locally?
Yeah. I was going to say, I was going to give actually a quick pitch, because I was going to say, keep doing what Derek started when he hosted a meeting upstairs here about 3 years ago, and keep on doing what Shelley did, which was bringing us in early in the design process and the thinking process, and really looking to us as partners in the development of the programs and initiatives that have really grown up. It has been 3 years. It was a little slow in getting up and running, but it was thoughtful, and actually, because we walked in the door saying that for 8 years prior to this, philanthropy had been out there in the fields doing all the work, and so please don't make the same mistakes that we did, and really let's learn together on how to make this work. And I would to me, that was one of the best things that has been accomplished in the past 3 years, is really sort of that growing comfort and relationship with the government as a partner in doing this work. More locally, I'm very much now affiliated and tethered to our local HUD Sustainable Community Regional Planning Grant, and having both the national office but also the local office as a real thought partner in helping us get through sort of the bumps and the bruises of really rolling out our local strategy. I mean, it has not been, because now we are learning as local and regional agents on how to act together. And one of the cues that we can take from you, especially in the sustainable communities process, are from the lessons that you've learned as agencies in learning how to work together. Because if it's not going to be easy for us, but thank you for sharing with us that it is not easy for you as well. And so helping us, being there with us and rolling up the sleeves and sort of slogging through the process, I think is really, really important. One of the best things that we can do in order to make this kind of work more sustainable and more successful is to stop what we had been doing in the past, which was when we got frustrated, we would create a workaround. And so sitting there and closing the door and beating each other up and telling the truth is probably one of the most useful things that we can do together.
That's great. So before I open it up for questions, I do want to recognize Derek Douglas. If you'd stand up for a minute, Derek, because he's the king of collaboration. Derek, if you had the privilege to work with Derek, he had no assets, no money, and all he had was his personality and his ability to get people to work together, and he did it, and he was amazing at it, and it's great to see you and have you here. Do we have questions from folks for the panel? Come on.
if I were to give a local, sort of a local reference to it, one place where you may want to do a workaround is where there's a moral imperative because people are in danger. And one of the things that, you know, whether it was good or bad that we did it, in our work in East Baltimore, there was a point in time, especially when the market was going really, really good and, you know, money was easy to get, and then the market collapsed. And there were a bunch of people who were promised that they were going to be taken care of and relocated. And so the market was not there. And so there was no other choice but to work around and make sure that the people that you'd made a commitment to were taken care of. I mean, to me, that's one place where there is no other reason to work around, to figure out a way to work around an existing system or process is when there's a moral imperative and people are in danger.
Anybody else want to ask that? You avoided that very well, by the way. You did that well.
You know, the challenge is, you know, you get frustrated. You think, why can't this? It just seems so simple. We should be able to do this, or like you said, Scott, moral imperative. You know, we have a achievement gap crisis that is threatening the future of our economies and our cities. So we should work around it. I think the problem with working around is it tends to make it less sustainable. If you jump into something and say, you know what, I'm going to get it done, you get it done for that moment. You might get it done for all the good, right reasons. But it's a lot harder to say that you built the infrastructure that's going to allow you to really move forward. It's a lot harder for people to come forward and give you money when they see you working around it as opposed to changing it. Now, sometimes you kind of almost have to do it simultaneously, working around it while trying to change. But I think you have to be careful and be very selective when you're working around it. And there may be crises that require it, but always remember the ultimate goal for me is the sustainability of our efforts, because as was mentioned many times earlier, these things don't change overnight.
Scott mentioned different types of foundations. I'd be interested in thoughts on, particularly Scott, national foundations versus community foundations and family foundations. You mentioned getting close to the community. Anybody's experience with this about how do we build partnerships with some of these community foundations, which are expanding across the country, but particularly family foundations, which are growing up as well. So any thoughts about that?
Anybody with experience with family foundations? Shanae?
We've actually partnered a lot with family foundations, and you know, I think that every philanthropic group has their own personality or quirk. There's also different areas of kind of expertise or avenues that work better with certain types of foundations than others. So, I mean, I think that family foundations are one of the largest growing groups, and they tend to be a little more limber because typically it's an individual donor or family that's still living, that's very engaged. So they have the best types of flexibility in terms of investing, but it's a lot harder to make the case to encourage them to invest. But I think that, you know, knowing the culture of every individual foundation, because not all family foundations are alike, so there's even differences in the personality of each individual institution, is important. And also knowing what you can leverage. I mean, there are a lot of resources beyond money, and at Prudential, you know, just talking from the lens of a corporate foundation, not only do we invest grants, but we also can do program-related investments, corporate investments. We also have a very huge human capital that we can bring to bear in terms of consultancies and technical assistance from many of the different corporate groups and businesses within the enterprise of Prudential. So don't look at just dollar signs, and I think really kind of do some research and understanding the culture and the values of the individual philanthropic groups.
Great, Dick.
Dick Fleming from St. Louis, but I can't help but reflect on hearing the innovation and the courage that it's taken to do, I guess I call it SC squared, it's trying to become. The challenge that I'd be interested from the panelists and from the folks here in the philanthropic community is the administration had some of the resources at the outset to do this in the honeymoon of the new administration. But with the political gridlock that is there today and is likely to be there in the next administration, how does the possibly
experience of what's really happening here get translated back to the players down the street on Pennsylvania Avenue in the post-earmark era, where the federal partners in this are having great difficulty finding the unencumbered sort of civic venture capital to continue to do this. How do we find a way to have that light go on for both parties and for the two houses of Congress, that it's okay to let the administration innovate a little bit?
Well, let me say, first of all, that depending upon the outcome of the fall elections, we may hope that gridlock happens because things could get a lot worse really quickly. And not only not moving forward, but we could really significantly move backwards in terms of some of the initiatives that we're working on. But I think under either circumstance, because you're right, there's going to be a lot less money, that's why the stepping up from the philanthropic community and from the local business community becomes increasingly important, because it is that change. I mean, the days of these large amounts of money coming from Washington, D.C. are over, but there's a lot of folks that want to try to do things a little differently here. And you may still be able to do that from an administrative standpoint. I know that's one of the things the Obama administration is trying to do, to say, you know, let's look at every possible thing that we can do that doesn't require an act of Congress, because it's just so difficult to get something going right now. You hope that it gets better. But I do think that the one thing about changing attitudes is they want to be attached to success. So I think if we can demonstrate through these partnerships and these cooperative relationships success, I think that people will get behind, and you know, it's the old, you know, big success has 1,000 fathers, or mothers, or aunts and uncles, and everything else. I think people will want to be a part of that. We have to demonstrate that it works.
I would just add two things from my perspective. One is we need to get much better at telling the story about what is successful. You know, the people who are gathering around sustainable communities and things like that. That message needs to start getting out there. There are other initiatives that have been taking place. Matt Ammon was here. I had worked with Matt on Green and Healthy Homes initiative, and looking at the way the government, you know, brought its resources together that actually save money and produce better outcomes for families. A bottom line investment is something that almost anybody will pay attention to, but we need to get that story out there in a much more effective way.
So I think our time is up. I think the Vice President's coming in next.
I'm a poor substitute. I want you all to join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Another great conversation on the way to learning more about how to do this work on the ground. So thank you very much for Ben for moderating, for the panelists for sharing their knowledge with us. So we're now making a transition, and it's a transition to roundtable discussions where there'll be more opportunity for exchange and discussion on these topics. So if you take out your folders, there's this agenda, turn it around. There are a set of sessions on the back. I want to assure you that there will be people who will help find your way, because it's a little complicated in this building. So the first session is on finding, recruiting, retaining talent, and it will be in room 401. So you might want to find an elevator and go upstairs, or if you're super healthy, walk up the stairs to 401. There will be guides for you on that session. The next session is developing an economic vision, and that's room 230A. So it's second floor. And then creating greater efficiency, innovative service delivery is in room 428. So there's also one add-on that we did at the last minute, because we end up having a lot of funders that use PRIs, program-related investments, and other investments in community development financial institutions. So there's another session that we added on that's targeted to those groups that is in 485. So we have a terrific set of other folks who've come to help share their knowledge and get a discussion going, so please join one of those sessions. We will not be coming back to this room, so please take all of your things with you when you go to this next session. On behalf of the team that has worked on this, and Keith, can you pull the folks in if there are anybody out there? I want you to help me acknowledge the team of folks who have really helped put this together. Both, nobody, they're all gone. All right, so in absentia, Keith is one of them, but there are a number of folks on my staff and in the White House that have really dedicated a lot of time and effort, and I will tell them that they got a round of applause. So I think they may be posted to help you find the way. So out this door and to those rooms, ask anybody in the hallway for help if you need it. Thanks.